Hi, this is Professor Harry Elam again, and thank you to all the students who wrote questions or comments and were on the website talking about the art of fielding. And I thought I'd start in terms of response with one from, I believe the student's name was Bruce Wayne. He says, "There are many quotable passages in the book, but this one struck me the most. Quote, Schwartz would never lie in a world so open. He would always be occluded by the fact that his understanding and his ambition outstripped his talent. He'd never been as good as he wanted to be, not at baseball, not at football, not at reading Greek or taking the LSAT. And beyond all that, he'd never be as good as he wanted to be. He never found anything inside himself that was really good and pure, that wasn't double-edged, that couldn't just as easily become its opposite. He had tried and failed to find that thing, and he would continue to try and fail, or else he would leave off trying and keep on failing. He had no art to call his own." I think it's interesting they use art in there in the book, The Art of Fielding. He knew how to motivate people, manipulate people, move them around. This was his only skill. He was like a minor Greek god you barely heard of, who sees through the glamour of the armor and down on the petty complexity of each soldier's soul, and in the end is powerless to bring about anything resembling his vision. The loftier, arbitrary gods intervene. So here's the question that he had after that. That's the quote. "What is your opinion of the ambition connected with Mike Schwartz and at a universal level related to the ambitions of undergraduates in becoming the next destructive startup? The most relevant part of the novel was perhaps a struggle with his own ambition. At the end, I thought this wasn't addressed well enough. Mike wins a baseball scholarship while addicted to drugs and accepts a decent job as a coach, but we are never told of his future plans or what he still hopes to do. Is his ambition gone? Did he settle to be with Pella and dedicate the rest of his life to his love of Western College home?" Good question, and thinking about the character of Mike Schwartz, and thinking about all of the characters and how they relate to each other. And one of the major issues that this student raises is one that's critical to the book, is what do we think about this in relationship to college students and ambition and life at college and dreams of the future. Well, one of the things I think that the book asks, and Mike is at the center of that, is how can we be, or is Mike honest with himself in thinking about what he wants to do and be? If you remember where he applied to law school, he only applied to the best law schools. He had no sense of, if we call it as you all in applying to college, no safety schools, no sense of where he might go other than that, to Harvard, to Yale, to Stanford, excuse me, the important one I forgot there for a second. So that sense of knowing himself and thinking honestly about himself and understanding his relationship to the world in and around him, and really, well, he's articulating in here his sense of ambition outstripped his talent. Well, the idea in that paragraph later comes what, in a sense, his true talent was working with people and understanding people, and the fact that he felt that that was some way settling. So one of the things that all the characters have to do within the course of the book is to make peace with themselves, to think about themselves and try to confront themselves honestly. And it happens in different ways for each one, and each one is enforced or impacted by the circumstance around them. So we see for Mike, what happens in and around to Henry, what happens to Pella, what happens all around him is informing the choices he makes and that he's going to do in life. No, potentially we don't know what he's going to do, and I think that open question is one of the things the book has. It doesn't resolve all the things at the end, but lets that to our imagination to think about, where these characters go from here. So it's not a closed system at the end of the book, but open to possibilities. But the major thrust, I think, is getting the characters to think about, to see, instead of outward, what Mike has done quite successfully in thinking about how he can impact other people, but to think and see inward. This is moving a little bit on in the quote from that same student, and here's some rhetorical things that he brings up. One, we all have big dreams, yes, at some point or another in our lives. In terms of Mike Schwartz, I would like to believe that he kind of came to realize his true calling, which we spoke about. He wanted to be a lawyer. I'm not sure where that came from, and he didn't want to coach, but he loved Westchester, gave his whole being to it, built it up in even bigger glory. This harkens to Death of a Salesman. So Willy Loman wanted to succeed in business, and he forced his son Biff to have the same mindset. But Biff was able to realize that the grandiose dream was not for him. No, he was better off and happy with a bag of cement in his hands, and Willie was too far gone and too late to change his mind. Yeah, I think this an analogy which many of you may have read in high school, Death of a Salesman, or some of you may read it in college, and within that character, Willy Loman has a son, Biff, and he says the best thing, Willie believes that the best thing is to be liked, and to be well-liked, and he skirts around edges, and he is not true to himself. And so this relates to my earlier point, and one of the major scenes within that play is a confrontation between Biff and his father at the dinner table, where he says, we're nothing but a dime a dozen. And he tries to confront him with the truth of their life and seeing himself in a different way. And while it works for him and, in a sense, exorcises him of this situation that he's come in terms of being his father's son, it is too late for Willie. So that theme, again, is one that I spoke to. I mean, it's not that you don't have dreams and shouldn't have dreams and want to fulfill your dreams, and they all do. But that sense of how you confront those dreams and how you confront yourself within relation to them is important. I think what's also going to be important is this notion of the art of fielding, the very title of the book, and that sense of the art that came into it. What is that? If we understand art as practice, if we understand art as being, a skill, but it's a skill that's honed, if it's a skill that we think about, reflect on, that we get others to impact, what is the art of fielding for each one of these characters? How do we understand that in each one of their lives as they struggle to figure out what they're going to do in college and potentially after? This comes from Vivian Lamb. I agree. The risk in sacrificing for some type of ambition is absolutely terrifying. And I share a similar sentiment in wondering whether I would be happier chasing those dreams, especially at the expense of perhaps family, friends. In the case of Death of a Salesman, I would say that Willy Loman did not have the self-awareness that Schwartz did. We made Schwartz so real. What made Schwartz, so real was his painful knowledge that he wasn't great. Loman wallowed in the self-aggrandizement from immense self-delusion. He wanted those dreams, but he didn't even work to chase them. Plus, Loman failed to even pinpoint moral qualities to being human. That's great, Vivian, and those relate to some of the points that I was just talking about in thinking about this work. And it's also thinking about the place where each of these characters are. Willy Loman is an older man at this point, a salesman who's been, in a sense, deceiving himself for all of these years. When we see these characters and confront them in The Art of Fielding and at college, they're on the verge. So you've heard too many times that college are some of the best years of your life. Well, they're in that period where the future is uncertain and possible, where Willie is at a point where he's reflecting back on all that's been, and the future is certainly not what he wanted or hoped for it to be. So when we think of the characters then in terms of their sense of ambition and their sense of self-awareness, we can think of the factors that impact that and how they reflect and potentially impact on each other. So there's an incredible sense of interdependence. So we have Schwartz, who needs Henry, to a sense, to fulfill the ambition. Henry, who has incredible talent on the baseball field like no one we've ever seen or he's ever seen before. But we have Henry, who's equally dependent on Schwartz as his sort of, for lack of a better word, a guru or someone who he needs and sees in a certain way. And when that relationship breaks down, he has problems. Henry can't even throw to first base anymore. So the skills that he had, he questions in a certain way. And then within that, the triangle that involves Pella in terms of each one of them and how it impacts them, as well as the president of the university, who is the father of Pella. So we have those relationships, each impacting on each other and impacting on each character's worldview and their sense of ambition or dreams and how they see those dreams. This next post, again, comes from Vivian, and then there's one that I'll refer to from Mario. So let me read Vivian first, and it says, repetition, ritual, routine, it seems that we derive purpose from doing the same things in a constant rate. And to maintain the routine is to find purity, to do the same things because we want to find bliss. For Henry, it was the sameness, quote, this is a quote from the book, it was the sameness, the repetition that gave life meaning. And to reach perfection, or at least some sort of self-justification, you have to be a machine. But what allowed Henry to grow was his abruptive ending of his state of thoughtless being. What allowed Pella, Mike, Owen, and Athenlight to change and become more content with themselves was an aberration in their daily cycle of their plans for the future. Interesting. This comes from Mario. I find it significant that you use both ritual and routine in your posts, since these are two very different words, although their outward appearance in the real world is a matter of minor nuances. Ritual is described with the significance of a ceremonial act, while being regularly repeated in a set, precise manner. However, routine is action of a commonplace or repetitious character. Interesting. And I'll talk about that in 1 second. Aparicio Rodriguez describes 3 stages essential to the art of fielding: thoughtless being, thought, and returning to thoughtless being. Therefore, I believe that Henry's seemingly thoughtless being is only as effective in his baseball career as the thought that takes place and is soon replaced by thoughtless being yet again. I feel that the stage of thought is what distinguishes Henry's role on the field as ritual rather than routine. Yeah, I love this in terms of thinking of the distinction between ritual and routine, and thinking of the art of fielding as something much done by Aparicio Rodriguez as being virtually a book of religious or spiritual thought rather than just being a book of practical teaching in terms of baseball. And that sense of routine as being a repeated acts, or ritual, I'll give you another definition in terms of ritual. Ritual is being an act that links us to something beyond. Okay? That's one definition of ritual, and ritual has, as a signifying practice, has meaning within our everyday lives, and also that idea of having something that has a powerful force to connect us something beyond ourselves. So religious ritual connecting us to a spiritual force beyond that. So that sense within the play of when does it for Henry? Yes, not in the play. Within the novel, when does it for Henry move beyond something that he's just doing every day that links him to something that's a higher sense of himself, his worth, that connects him to something beyond? So the spiritual quest is something potentially we can see within each of the characters. And what's interesting within it is how within each of their quests, it's linked to a particular book, a novel. So the sense of literature is connected to that. Henry reads The Art of Fielding, but he doesn't really understand it, though he's tied to the book and he's read it. It's probably the only book he's ever read, right? But he reads it again and again. And so for each of them, there's that sense of text, certainly for Athenlight, and that sense of connection to it that somehow informs what they do and informs his sense of spiritual quest for each one of the characters. This is Mario concluding. I conclude that what made Henry become immersed in self-doubt for a period of time was not that he lost routine on the field, but rather he lost ritual on the field, and then it was likely caused by Schwartz's gradual separation from Henry. I'd agree with those things, beginning with the lies about law school admission and growing into a sort of a jealousy. Yeah, their relationship and the complex interdependence of them, and the sense of how that informs them, and the sense of self-awareness potentially they gain, from the fact that Schwartz is not getting into law school, that they each have this relationship with Pella, and so it opens them up to awareness potentially that they didn't have before, that brings them out of, in a sense, thoughtless being into a different sense of thought, not only about what they do, but about themselves. This comes from Sarah. She says, the novel itself identifies 5 main characters: Henry, Gwert, Owen, Mike, Pella, but I found that Henry's story was the most prominent and dominated the plot and much the meaning of the book, in my opinion. Assuming that the 5 characters were meant and therefore written to be equal parts and be accessible to all readers, why is it that Henry is so much more so? Is there something intangible in his persona that makes him the ideal protagonist for the readers to relate to? Technically speaking, each of the 5 main characters has characters that make them appealing and allow readers to relate to them on an emotional level. For example, if you find yourself in a situation where you have lost your way in life, Pella is instantly relevant. If you find that your life is hitting a glass ceiling, Mike is easily identified. But what is it that makes Henry so universal? it is the fact that he seems to be the underdog, or do we fear the failure that he feels every day as his shortstop dreams get away from him? Great question, and I think that one of the things that I would suggest that the book does is it creates these 5 characters that are interlocked and interdependent in a way, so we can find different things to identify with each one of them. And in fact, it may be, as you suggest, where you are in life that brings you into relationship or with empathy with any of them. So an old man like me, when I see the president, Affenlife, and Gwirt, there's some relationship with that I see to him, or affinity. Of course, my immediate horror at what he's done, and a relationship with a student is nothing that can be in any way something that you look at and want to think of something to admire in a president. Rather, you see his weakness, in a sense, and his foibles, and his sense of coming to a new sense of self-awareness of who he is, and eventually, where does it lead, but ultimately to his death. So with each of the characters is points of entree for us as audience, as readers, in terms of the sense of how we feel about them. The sense of the universal is something I wouldn't put on Henry, or any of the characters, but what I see in Henry that perhaps makes him an interesting one is an innocence. As an innocence in terms of self, that he's defined simply by not what's inside of him, in a sense, but what he does. His enactment on the baseball field becomes what's defined him. An innocence about it. He sees himself, or he sees himself in relationship to that. And so the sense of him moving to a different sense of from innocence, from thought to thoughtlessness to thought-filled being, is the idea that within that struggle, it's very, very painful. And we see it, we feel it, and potentially we can identify with that, the moments that we struggle that are painful. And we all know that there have been moments in life that are going to be hard, and that we're going to have to struggle through. And there's a sense of relationship to that. But for each of the characters, I think there's that. I think what Owen is another very, very interesting character. And in a way that he announces his sexuality, that announces his racial heritage right from the beginning. He outs himself. And never is it a sense that he in any way, because of who he isn't anything but celebratory of who he is. And that's great, in a sense, to see within the novel and see how others relate to him in that. So there's a space, as much at Stanford as there is at this college, this imaginary college, for Owen to be, as well as for Henry to be, as well as for Mike to be, as well as for Pella to be. So a sense of the difference in them, in allowing each other's difference, is one of the, I think, virtues of the book, and one of the strengths of it, in showing these differences and showing and finding ways that wherever we are as audience, we can find a way into their difference. This last issue comes again from Mario, and Mario says, "This is perhaps one of the most significant factors of similarity between the 5 prominent characters that Sarah Young mentioned. In the case of Henry, the conclusion indicates that baseball is his home. However, along the path to this conclusion, Henry appears to be tempted to believe wrongly that home is elsewhere, such as his relationship with Schwartz, who was the first to introduce Henry to baseball as a career opportunity, seeing that Henry was initially planning on entering into apprenticeship with his father instead of playing baseball at college. Similarly, Gwirt sensed his first inclination to erudition, and specifically H. Melville, as his home when he discovered the manuscript at his college. However, in the search for this metaphysical relationship with Melville, he mistakenly finds himself thinking his relationship with Owen to be his home. Ultimately, we see that Pella provides her father with his aquatic post-mortem dwelling or home. Meanwhile, Mike and Pella end up finding their home in each other and at Westish, despite traversing through law school application and misleading liaisons, and Owen finds his home in scholarly study as he travels to Tokyo. I think this is great, and I like bringing it back to the subject. And these are questions I think you want to bring with you when you come to new student orientation and to the 3 books discussion during that, to the authors, to see how the intersections of home across all 3 books, or the questions of home within this book, And what is home? The idea that home is more than a place, it's a feeling, it's an idea, it's a place where, that cliche is, the sense of home is where the heart is, and what you determine to be home, it's a constructed place, a place where potentially you feel safe, with the others around you. So what constitutes home for each of the characters is a process. And that's what we see within this work. The process of coming home and being at home in a sense, if it's a place where you feel safe, where you feel yourself, that all of them have to get to the point where they feel and understand and can reflect on themselves in new and different ways. And that final sense, in a sense, for Gwirt, of being put to sea, of his ashes going out there, becomes a memorial, but becomes, in a sense, a ritual act that links him with that sense of the sea, with a sense of Melville, with a sense of experience and feeling home potentially like he hadn't for some time. So it's an act, in a sense, that is an act of forgiveness for him, and an act that ritually, in a sense, unites them as well in this sense of experience of finding home. So that's my thoughts on the book with you today. I love the questions that you had, and I'm really jazzed by the fact that there's such a rich discussion of it on the website. So keep it up. If there are other questions, you can find me not so much on the web. You can find me next time in my office. I look forward to meeting you all during new student orientation or during the first year. My office is in Suite Hall, upstairs on the 4th floor. Please do at some point come by and make an appointment to see me. I'd love to talk more about this book or the other books. And I'll be teaching a class in the fall, and love to see you there or elsewhere. Have a great end to your summer, and look forward to seeing you at new student orientation. Thanks.